There's a quote, I don't remember who it's from, we can look it up and add it in later, but the author said that writing a novel is like having an empty swimming pool and going out every day with a cup of water to fill it. And so it's sort of, you have to trust in gradualism, you have to trust in time and how incremental progress can lead to an eventual fulfillment. I'm Phong Nguyen, the author of the novel Bronze Drum. I also teach at the University of Missouri, where I'm the Miller Family Endowed Chair in Literature and Writing. I've written 5 books, which include 3 novels and 2 short story collections, and my individual stories have appeared in more than 50 national literary journals across the country. I've also edited some volumes too.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over the world.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on, Phong.
Thanks for having me.
What does it mean to be Vietnamese to you nowadays?
I think that nowadays is really key, right? Because it sort of evolves and changes throughout one's life. And I think right now it means pride and belonging to a thousands-year-old culture, one that, in the relatively recent history is being discovered and better known throughout the world.
I finished Bronze Drum over the weekend, and one thing that I kept thinking about over and over and over again is how close we were, the Vietnamese, come to extinction.
Yeah.
You know, with all of these invaders and all of these people trying to take over Vietnam, it's really miraculous that we have become and have remained here on Earth.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary way to put it. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but you're right. I mean, the punitive nature of the Ma Yuan's campaign, it could have led to something far more severe than what we had, which was already oppressive enough to the Lac Viet people at the time. And it could have not just endured for as long as it had, but it could have remained, and it could have led to, as you say, a kind of extinction.
If this book was read to me when I was 7 or 10 years old, I think it would have had a profound difference on my psychology because of the pride that it instills in young women, young men after reading it. And, this is something that relatively very old, obviously very old tale in Vietnamese culture, but in Vietnamese American culture, I mean, most of us probably have heard a little bit about the Trung sisters, but not to the extent of how you've painted the picture, the story.
Yeah, it was very meaningful to me growing up. It's not as though my father was telling me the story of the Trung sisters as a way of instilling Vietnamese culture in me and my brothers, but rather it was just one of his favorite stories. So, he would also tell the story of Journey to the West, the Monkey King story, and he would tell the story of the Three Kingdoms, and he would tell the story sometimes of, the Fable de La Fontaine, and so it was just kind of one of his go-to stories, and the consequence of that is it became part of my canon of characters and stories, and then I experienced some frustration when I would go to school and people wouldn't know the same characters and stories that I knew, and then went to college and my professors didn't even know who these characters were and about their story. And so, part of my motivation for writing it is, as you say, to be able to read about these characters and to take pride in those examples.
What did your dad do? What was his profession?
My dad, he was a chemical researcher for Johnson & Johnson for about 35 years. So he came to the United States on scholarship in 1962. and went to the University of Montana. Sorry, Montana State University in Bozeman. Got his PhD in chemistry at University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he met my mother, who was studying languages and linguistics. And then soon after that, he went to work for Johnson & Johnson and did that until he retired.
I'm so grateful that somebody like you wrote a book like this. And, like I told you earlier, now we want more.
Yeah.
We want more of this stuff. You've done the Jung sisters, and now, is there any way that we can expect more of this type of material to show up?
Well, thank you, first of all, for saying that. And I envision this book as the beginning of dialogue, the beginning of conversation, not as any kind of definitive version, because it's my interpretation of their story. And I would love to see more books about the Jung sisters, and not just about the Jung sisters, but about Chu, or about Le Loi, or any, so many other Vietnamese legends and stories that incorporate both history and myth. It's a fascinating kind of territory to explore in literature, and maybe someday in film and television. And so I don't have any presumption that I'm going to take up that burden myself, but I hope that people continue to delve in the same territory and come up with new discoveries.
What other sort of things did you think that you were going to be doing as you got older, as an adult?
That's a great question. I think I was of a generation that didn't have as clear of a sense of professional destiny as, let's say, my children's generation. So my children all knew, or seemed to know, what they want to do at a very young age professionally. So like my oldest son is now in graduate school for mathematics, and he has wanted to be a mathematician since he was in the 6th grade. My middle son is starting college, planning to study linguistics. And up until college, and even after, I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know what I wanted to do for money, so I think that was more accepted in my generation, where you go to college and you can have the liberal arts experience without being pressured to pick what you're going to study right away. I mean, it kind of helped that my oldest brother was an academic star and is working at Google now, and succeeded on those terms. So there was less pressure on me to succeed on the same terms, I think. But I think when I envisioned my future, I probably pictured some music involved, maybe some art, something artistic, but I didn't necessarily know that I was going to be building my life around writing.
At what point you're like, okay, I'm going to start putting, pen to paper, and I'm going to go into this?
Yeah, with this particular project, you mean?
No, with your writing career.
Oh, writing in general. Oh, so I have kind of a little origin story that I tell about how I decided that I was going to commit myself to writing. And it's the year I took off from college. I went to Bard College, which is, kind of an elite private school, and I was not prepared for it. So I took a year off. I met my future wife, Sarah, there, and we lived in a cottage in Connecticut with no heat or hot water.
Wow.
And then we worked at a waste paper company as assistants to the assistant accountant, doing data entry on this, these old CRT screens with the green lettering and the windowless basement office, and it was miserable. And so as kind of spiritual survival, I needed to wander, and I would go through the streets of New Haven, and sometimes, there'd be a building that's open, like the Co-op or something. I'd walk into it, and I went into a used bookstore, and at random picked out a book which turned out to be Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, translated by C. Scott Moncrieff. And for the first time, and maybe only time in my life, time just elapsed. Like I had no sense of time passing, and suddenly the shop was closing, and they needed me to either buy the book or get out. And I bought the book, and it's a massive volume, and I carried it around with me for a year. I was a very slow reader, and he just did impossible things with language, things even in translation, because the original is in French. And I wanted to do a little bit of that impossible, and so it inspired me to commit myself to writing. And I didn't have any awareness of Proust as like being like, people think that Proust is this like big pretentious kind of academic name, but at the time I was just enamored of the sentences and didn't think of it as his reputation or anything. I just thought of it on the level of the language, and found it to be so stirring and moving and beautiful and articulate.
When I read and listen to words, sometimes or most times there's just standard descriptions, things that are just being said to kind of like paint the idea.
Yeah.
And I'm trying my best to explain this because I'm not an academic, but when you say you wanted to do the impossible with words, I think about the Bronze Drum, and I think about Viet Thanh Nguyen, the kind of writing that's for me impossible, and quality where it shines is when it's ideas that seem so familiar, but is put in a totally different angle and a different light that you go, what the... You just get sucked in because it's just a completely radically different way of seeing something that's very familiar, but in a very different way, or in a tone that it's like it's existed for all of eternity, but then this is so fresh to hear the first time. And I feel like that's what I kept hearing over and over in the Bronze Drum.
That's amazing to hear. I feel that way reading Viet Thanh Nguyen, is that I didn't know that I knew that until I read it. It was like it has always been there, and so it's wonderful to hear that a reader can have that experience with Bronze Drum as well.
Yeah. And then, you have to do so much other acrobatics with story design and pacing and keeping up, trying to make it all balanced. But then on top of that, there's this sort of the impossible with words, and it's beautiful. There's probably a skeletal version that exists throughout the history of the Chung sisters. How did you sort of mitigate and balance the amount of your artistic infusion into the book?
It was a long road, and it was frustrating at first because I thrive on information as a writer. I need to, the more the better, the more details already exist within the story, the better. And I was working with a scholar who is an anthropological archaeologist at University of Wisconsin named Nam Si Kim. And he wrote the book, The Origins of Ancient Vietnam. And working with him, I learned, some very important things which I brought to bear on the story, but I also learned how little is known about so many things in terms of, the medicinal system of the time, the calendrial system of the time, like all the material culture stuff, like, that is good. But the stuff that is immaterial was much harder to figure out because so little is known. And so I was frustrated by that for a long time. And then I kept hearing from fellow writers like, that should be liberating. You should be able to, realize you can do anything then, And eventually I came around to that understanding that having that license was a benefit rather than a drawback.
Wow.
And there are, so there are key deviations from the history. So there's, a lot of things are mentioned that would not have existed 2,000 years ago. The Aozai, the Non-La, the water puppetry, apparently they wouldn't have had elephants and war elephants at the time. So all those are sort of important enough to the pop culture version of the Chung sisters that I felt like I needed to include them, despite the fact that they deviated from history. And in terms of deviations from the sort of national myth of the Chung sisters in Vietnam, that was, more for narrative purposes. So, for example, in the attack on the palace, the Chung sisters themselves weren't there historically when their father and Tisak were killed. But it was important because the story is kind of told through their perspective, and for them to be there in order to witness it worked much better dramatically than to have them absent. So there are, most of the times where I was choosing between history and myth, I chose myth because it was more interesting. And most of the times between myth and invention, those times where I chose invention were times when it couldn't work dramatically the other way.
God, what a wonderful I feel so privileged to sit here and ask you that and hear that response,
Oh, wow, thank you.
Because the lines are blurred because I'm not a historian. I don't know what's fact and fiction, but it all works.
Yeah,
it works well.
Well, thank you. My hope is that, as I said, it begins a dialogue, it begins a conversation, and people become more interested in the Chung sisters as a result. My hope is that people don't receive this as a work of history exclusively, but as a historical fiction with an emphasis on the fiction side of things. In the acknowledgments at the end of the book, I mentioned that my father wants the readers to know that this is a work of fiction, and he said that many times as I was talking to him about it, as he was reading it. He's like, just make sure that people know this is a work of fiction. I said, well, it says novel in the front and it's shelved in the fiction section. He's like, still, just make sure that they know it's a work of fiction. So it's important.
Yeah, and another thing that stood out for me was the sort of the family infrastructure, or the way that daughters respond to their dad, and it feels like sort of like a modern way of painting these sisters, because I can't imagine 2,000 years ago like any parent or daughters would talk and converse with their parents in that kind of way.
Same way. Yeah. So I was talking to a historian, Min-Soo Kang, who's at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and he asked the question of, how do you balance the modernizing with the, delving into the historical, when if I tried to render exactly the historical way that they spoke, first of all, there's no way for me to know that.
Right.
And second of all, it would be incomprehensible to the modern reader.
Right.
And so that it's inevitable that there's going to be a kind of modernizing. What people tend to take notice of is, and be surprised by, is the differences from between a culture that did not have a traditional family structure and a modern kind of nuclear family unit kind of thing.
Jung Yi's response to her mother after the gardener's son, and going out to sort of be her own woman, was he was very blown away by that take.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that idea?
So one of the things that I recall reading about the Chung sisters is that Chung Chak was more interested in military strategy and Chung Yi was more of a warrior. And to me, that seemed to imply a whole host of other contrasts in their sibling relationship. And so I saw Yi as possessing a certain unquenchable fire, right? And part of that was inevitably going to inform her relationship to her parents. And the fact that she was an aristocrat perhaps enabled her to be more rebellious than she otherwise would have been. But it's also at a time where these things are still being negotiated, where the family itself is still being negotiated, because the influence of Confucianism is only 100 years old, and there's still these very traditional ways of viewing things and of experiencing the world, which contradict it.
Yep. The way a modern reader like me related to the two sisters is whenever you were going to one voice or the other voice or description of either sister, I took upon it. I imagined myself as being, the rebel, the freedom, the thrill seeker, the adventure seeker. Oh, wait, I also have a very strategic side. I also have a very calm. It sort of allowed me to kind of relate in a way that, we have both sides of this in each person.
That's great. I'm really glad to hear that, because I find for myself sometimes if I read a book with two focal characters, I side with one or the other, and it's hard to relate to both, especially when there's such strong contrast between them. So I'm glad that was your experience. I hope that is readers' experience, that they identify strongly with both Chongchak and Chongyi, as opposed to just saying one or the other. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, they're both heroic, right? So me as a young, in my mind, I'm like, I want to be a hero just like Chongchak or Chongyi, right? Like, I want to be both of them. And so every time one of them pops up and the story's focused on that sister, I'm like, oh my God, I want to be that person. My young child boy inside me saying that I want to be that. I want to be that. So it balances out, it rounds out the relationship that I have with the reading.
Yeah. That's beautiful. I think that if you can read with that, the mind of that and the perspective of that inner child, that's wonderful. Anytime that happens.
Why this story and not like the 10 other ones that Vietnam has?
Yeah. So I grew up with this being the main story, because there was the story that my father was most interested in, right? So I knew about some other legends, but I didn't know them as deeply or care about them as much, because they weren't told to me as often and weren't told to me with such a sort of loving care, So in some ways it was just inevitable that I was going to write the story of the Chung sisters, as opposed to any variety, any other story. But also there's so many little stories within the story which are so wonderful, like the hunting of the tiger, the skinning of the tiger, and then writing their version of the Declaration of Independence right on the skin of the tiger. I didn't make that up, right? That's the part of their story. And the Feng Tichen, who gives birth on the battlefield, slings the baby into the quiver and keeps on fighting. That's just sheer badassery.
Yeah.
And there's so many stories throughout the book that I was just eagerly awaiting writing them, because I've for so long enjoyed hearing about them.
Shout out to Queen O. She is the person that narrated the audible version.
Yeah, narrates it beautifully.
Beautifully. She did a great job. She introduced us, and so thank you so much, Queen.
Yes.
I reached out to her as I was working through the book and listening, and just texting her saying, I cannot believe a man wrote this. and she said, this is what she said to me. That was, she said, Fong's done the work. Mm-hmm. And the work is the processing of, I think what she means is the perspective of a woman.
Yeah.
And, the ideas inside of these women, and that for me probably takes a lot of courage to say, I'm going to tell the story, as a man, to take on that as a big task.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you do that?
So I think that's one of the reasons why it was a long road, is feeling as though I had the right to tell their story for a variety of reasons. But one thing that helped me access their characters in the story was thinking of them not from the outside in, not like here are these women, et cetera, but here is Chongchak, here is Chongyi. They're individuals with selves and the consciousnesses, and consciousness is not gendered, right? The experiences of women and men can be quite different as their lived experience, but in terms of the essence of the consciousness itself, there's nothing that says this is the way that women think ultimately, this is the way that men think ultimately. So thinking of them as individuals was key to writing this book and creating their characters. In terms of representing the strength of the Chung sisters, part of that had to do with my own sense of the strength of women in my life and the women in public life, and women who, for one reason or another, society, and in American society, we still have not had a woman head of state, and people are overlooking and somehow blind to the strength and leadership of these great women leaders. And so part of the motivation for writing it as well was demonstrating how powerful and great such leadership can be.
And that brings me to this idea of using the word king throughout the novel. Can we talk about that? Why king and not queen?
Yeah. The name, right, Trung Vung, means the she king of the Viets, right? And so it was just inherent, I think, in the language and in I perhaps there wouldn't have been an equivalent of a co-regent in the time. I'm not sure why the term king is so insisted upon, but it is in translations and in the histories of the Chung sisters. And so I was writing them as she kings instead of as queens because it was consistent with what I had been reading.
Oh, interesting. How that's like baked into Trung Vương.
Yeah.
Vương is king, I'm assuming, right?
The Trung Vương is the she king of the Viets is how it was shown to me.
Yeah, because you don't hear these two described as Nu Hoang, which is queens. You hear Trung Vương, and it was very interesting because it was a big question as I'm reading the book, constantly hearing the word king as we're describing these women.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps there's just no better word in English, right, to describe their leadership, right, than king. Perhaps there could be a better one, but there isn't. Right?
Yeah, and that deliberate use of the word king is fascinating, and I'm curious to hear how other people, from now till in the next few years, how they react. And I look forward to sitting with other people at dinner to hear about their idea of like this use of the word king.
Yeah. It's interesting because it was a clear choice at some point, but it wasn't one that I had thought of as giving particular weight, only because it was what I had been reading in the history of the Chung sisters. Yeah.
You address mental health in this book. I felt that there was these ideas of mental health, like littered throughout dropped throughout the book. And was that a conscious decision, or that's something that?
It's fascinating. It is something that I have family history of mental illness and things like that. So there's it's certainly something that's on my mind, and it wasn't necessarily something that I was putting as like, you know what I mean, a like topic of the week kind of thing. It wasn't anything like that. It was just, if you know, the its presence is probably there because it's such a big presence in my life.
Has the writing of the book, the researching of it, affected in any way your relationship to your wife, to your mother, to women in general?
That's a question probably best directed to my wife. But that's a good question, a very good question. I've noticed some changes, but I don't know whether to attribute them to the writing of the book. It wasn't like I would write a passage and then I would have this big breakthrough in my relationship or whatever. But it was, I think, more gradual. And I should say this isn't the first time that I've written about women from the perspective of women. So I don't know if it's a sort of a much older development in my history of my relationship. But
makes sense.
That's a question for somebody who's more self-aware than I am, I think.
By you just saying that, it shows how self-aware you are. How long did it take for you to write it?
I started researching it maybe 2013, but not, I was also writing other projects, so I wasn't sort of doing that full time or anything. I started writing it in 2016. I completed it in 2020, and it's been kind of a 2-year route to publication. So.
Wow, it's almost 10 years.
Yeah. So if you count that sort of early research phase, then almost 10 years. Yeah.
What does it take for an artist, a writer, a musician, or somebody who's creating to stay on the path for that long? Because I'm sure, as a creative, you have a lot of different ideas, a lot of different avenues that you can pursue. What does it take to stay on this one project? How do you do that?
Yeah. So there's a quote, I don't remember who it's from. We can look it up and add it in later. But the author said that writing a novel is like having an empty swimming pool and going out every day with a cup of water to fill it. And so it's sort of, you have to trust in gradualism. You have to trust in time and how incremental progress can lead to an eventual fulfillment. And I think that comes from a lot of practice where, my first couple of books are collections of short stories, and, short stories obviously are kind of sprinting rather than marathoning, but you don't know that you're going to come out of it with a whole book of stories until you do. And then, even though you had been doing these sort of shorter projects, then eventually leads to this longer thing. And seeing that, I think, enabled me to realize that the same would be true of the novel, except that you don't get those, the instant gratification of, I'm going to publish this and then somebody's going to read it and then it's going to give me fuel to work on the next one. That has a much longer time horizon with a novel, and you have to believe in a project for a lot longer. And for me, I'm often driven by voice. If there's a voice that I like to inhabit for long periods of time, then I don't mind the work at all. In fact, it can be a great pleasure, and which is not to say it's easy, but yeah, that kind of daily devotion to the task of writing comes from both practice and from that evidence of it working before.
The idea of the drum patterns from the bronze drum. Was that historical, accurate, or did you kind of come up with that?
So, obviously the drums themselves are still remain a powerful symbol. But what they were used for is still, they speculate that they were used for ritual, for music, and for military, but they don't know for sure that they're used. And so it worked best within the story for them to be used for all three purposes. In terms of what the rhythms were, that's entirely my invention, because we cannot have known what the drum rhythms would have been. And I had a little bit with the onomatopoeia, right? The trying to simulate the sound of drums through, using a lot of different letters and different configurations. So,
what inspired this sort of idea of, this audio sort of rhythmic musical infusion into the story?
Yeah, it was from that speculation that it was used in military, and that it made sense to me that if it were used for a military purpose, it wouldn't just be used the way that you have drums in like an old British military, which is just to kind of raise morale, but instead would be used to
signal,
communicate. Yeah, and so once you have this idea that the drums are there to communicate, then it becomes a matter of how to get the whole army to cohere, right? And how to get it to move in synchronization. And so the training became less about the sparring and the practice with the weaponry, and more about making sure the army is moving in sync.
Is the bronze drum very specific to Vietnamese culture, or does it exist in China and Korea and other cultures?
So in the southern China and northern Vietnam, that Dong Son drum would appear, in during and before this period, right? I don't know beyond that, whether it appears in other cultures, but that particular style and that particular shape and everything, I think, is distinctly of northern Vietnam. What
are the next projects that you are working on, if you don't mind sharing?
No, I don't mind sharing at all. And I'm working on a project right now, which I think will have both a nonfiction and a fiction component to it, which is writing about family history. And it's surrounding an incident in 1947 when my father was 3 years old, and there was a French air attack on the estate where they were living outside the city of Nam Dinh. And unfortunately, his mother and his 1-year-old brother were killed in the airstrike. And after that, in order to process his grief, my father's father wrote a letter to my father about who his mother was, about the incident itself, about his process of grief. And he wrote it in French. It was translated into Vietnamese by his wife's family. It was kept in the family archives, and my father never received it until 1982. And he just happened to be visiting a family friend in St. Louis, who said, "Do you have a copy of the Le Livre de mon fils?" And he said, "I don't know what that is." And he said, "It's a letter that your father wrote to you when, after your mother died." And so he wrote to his contacts in Vietnam, had the letter sent to him. He translated it into English so that my mother could read it. And I read this letter almost by accident. And when I was 19 years old, my mother was cleaning out some old papers, and she said, "Oh, you might be interested in this." And, I grew up with my father not being very emotionally expressive. But here's this deep emotion in this letter about something so critical to our family history. And I wanted to write about it ever since. And so I plan to write a memoir about the journey of that letter, and about my father's journey to the U.S. and his parents in Vietnam. And I also plan to write a fictionalized version of this history centered more around my grandmother and my imagining of who she was and her experiences. So,
Can you tell me a little bit about the content of the letter?
yeah. So it first very straightforwardly lays out the day. And so it was, I think June 10th of 1947. This was like a retreat because they thought that the city of Nam Ninh would have been, was experiencing bombings and things like that. And so they had to flee from the city, and they thought they were safe in this countryside in the town called, I'm going to mispronounce it, but I think Hale. They were staying at this estate with a bunch of other families, and then he describes the approaching planes and how people didn't think that they were actually going to attack the estate because it was not a military compound or anything. It was just a bunch of families living there, and so they fled the building because they thought it would be bombed, but instead they kind of strafed the countryside. And my grandfather was holding my father, who was 3 years old at the time, and ran to this row of pines. And my grandmother was holding my uncle, who was 11 months old. And she was paralyzed with fright in the field. And a single bullet went through the baby's mouth and into the mother's heart. And the baby died instantly. And I think my grandmother struggled a little bit with before she died. And then it writes about his grief, and it writes about who she was and about how she was all about family, and how she loved games, and how she really appreciated her close friends. And then it was about so my grandfather was an engineer, a civil engineer. And so he puts it in almost mathematical terms when he's writing about his grief. And I wish I could remember, or I could probably look it up, but the exact terms that he uses, because I don't know from math at all, but he uses these sort of mathematical terms, so about like the derivative of our happiness is, with respect to zero, something, or and but it's beautiful despite it's sort of the use of math and stuff in it. And he talks about feeling like he'll eventually, feel normal again, but his body and mind rebel against feeling normal again, because that means that his wife and his son are diminished in his memory. And so it's a 30-page letter, and it's been translated in French to Vietnamese to English. So the version that I have also has some little ... dots for when the written was not legible. So I've just been always fascinated with the journey of that letter, and of course with my family history and what the effect of my father of growing up without a mother. I mean, his father remarried, but she didn't really pay that much interest in him, and so that's some of the stuff that the book's going to be about, or the books plural.
I just want to stop the podcast right now and have you email it to me. It's how fascinating, it is, because that letter, how long ago was it written?
It was written in 1947.
My maternal grandmother, there was 8 siblings. 5 of them died that way.
Oh my goodness.
5 of them died that way. French bombs.
Yeah.
And you think about the legacy of war, and some of my friends and I were talking about this last night about epigenetics and how it gets really into our cells, and whatever quantum theory or whatever's
Yeah,
going
yeah.
on we don't know about. It's a really tragic and traumatic chapter in the history of the Vietnamese people. But it dates all the way 2,000, you said 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And it's when I visited Vietnam with my father, I was very surprised that the people that we met seemed to like America and Americans, and didn't have any kind of the conflicted feelings that Americans have about Vietnam, and didn't have any kind of the bitterness and resentment. I could have been just exposed to a very narrow
Yep.
segment of the population that I don't know, but um, my sense of why that is, and the explanation that was given to me by my father is, well, that they have had these recent conflicts with the U.S., but the conflicts that with China run back thousands of years, and so the it's got to be seen through this lens where this is a very kind of small moment compared to the much longer history. I found the paragraph with the mathematical formulation if you're interested in hearing
Please,
that.
yes. Can you read that?
Yeah. Let's see. It comes to show a happiness which is always there is not felt very much, and we do not feel as happy as at the beginning. So having a lot of happiness makes us take it for granted, and to state it clearly in mathematical terms, the happiness a person feels at a point in time is simply the derivative of the function of happiness with respect to time. This means the happy feeling does not vary as the magnitude of this happiness, but it varies as the rate of change of his happiness. When a person experiences a constant happiness, the derivative of that happiness with respect to time is zero, which means he's in a state of indifference, neither joyful nor sad. Therefore, the matter of happy feeling, which is mistakenly called happiness, is an internal matter depending only on one's own view of one's situation.
Holy shit.
So,
75
yeah.
years ago.
Yeah, yeah. And that's, engineer,
Yeah.
discovering his poet's soul.
That's mind blowing.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I just remember reading this letters and, and 19 years old, just crying and thinking about how this, my father is the person he is because of this experience. And of course, not just this experience, but, it's his earliest memory, at 3 years old. My earliest memory is my dad singing to me, so.
Yeah. And your dad came to the United States when he was a young person.
Yeah, he was 18.
18, and he wasn't in the military or didn't have to go through. So his sort of position and stance on, all of that trauma, dodged it a little bit, right? He was able to kind of sidestep.
Yeah, I mean, except for his, this childhood trauma and
Right.
and experience. But so yeah, he was in, for most of it, he was in Madison, Wisconsin, and then he moved to New Jersey, where I grew up. But when he was in Madison, it was in the late 1960s, and there was some. So he denies it now, but he's told me that there was pressure on him to become activist in the against the Vietnam War, but his position was very complex. He thought that the South should have been more supported through money and weaponry and not with boots on the ground. And he thought that Johnson was kind of a shoot from the hip cowboy type of president. So, but more recently, when I've asked him about this, he's like, no, there was no pressure on me at all to get involved with that. So I don't know whether he's just trying to wave it away or what.
How has it been received in Vietnam?
So far, it's only been out a week in the U.S., and I've received some interest in having a translation, but I still have yet to see how it will be received. I hope it will be received in the spirit of that, as I said, sort of the opening of a dialogue and not a version that replaces the traditional version of the story, right? And so I don't know. I think its verdict is still out on how it will be received in Vietnam.
I wonder what the sort of powers to be, their reaction to the anti-Han. I wonder how that, because of their censorship, sort of, they want to play, nicely with the Chinese, and wonder how that equation all works out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I like to think that Ma Yuan's portrayal is as a more sort of subtler and nuanced portrayal of the Han Chinese character, and not as villainous as, say, the commander, or the governor. But yeah, I think there's always that potential that because the Chung sisters' enemy was the Han Chinese, that for a variety of reasons and a variety of contexts, people might not want to promote or spread it around. I was thinking of all these movie studios that have to make different choices based on, well, this won't please
play in China.
Yeah, it won't play in China. So, yeah, don't expect it coming to a theater near you anytime soon.
If you were to approach another myth or legend, a folklore in the same vein as the Chung sisters, would you be able to do it quicker?
Gosh, I hope so. But I don't know if I would. I think I wouldn't, probably because every book that I've written is a departure from the other books. It's always something different. And so it has to have something really new to it in order for it to excite me. And so I can't imagine kind of repeating myself and writing sort of the same or a different legend, but in the same way. So I would have to find a new way to tell that story. And so it probably would take me as long.
Yeah. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed the Bronze Drum, and I hope that we get a lot of people to read the book and ultimately to have the book turned into a more TV episodic or something that we can visually consume.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd love to see it. It's a story that was important to me, and I'm glad that it can be important to others as well.
Thank you for bringing it to life, and thank you for sharing your time with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for this broadcast and for this conversation.
Thanks, Phong.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcasts. Thanks again for listening.